There is a mystery that runs through the fabric of your life, a paradox, a truth concealed in the weakness you try to hide. But I declare to you today, God knows your weakness, and it is not to shame you. It is to shape you. He saw it before you were born. Before you failed, he knew the breaking point. Before the storm came, he foresaw the trembling. Before the denial, the betrayal, the wound, he saw it all. And still, he called you. The world says hide it. Religion says pretend. Pride says perform. But he says bring it. Bring your weakness to me. Why? Because he is the potter who doesn't discard cracked vessels. He is the shepherd who carries the lamb with the broken leg. He is the redeemer who doesn't wait for you to be strong. He becomes your strength. Do you remember Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver, wrestling in the night? And in the moment of his deepest struggle, what does the Lord do? He touches his hip, weakens him, and in that divine weakening, Jacob becomes Israel, the one who wrestles with God and prevails. Do you see it? In your weakness, the old name dies. In your limp, a new walk is born. In your wound, your destiny begins. Gideon, the least of his tribe, hiding in the winepress. The angel doesn't call him by his fear, he calls him by his future. Mighty man of valor. Why? Because God doesn't speak to the weakness as it is, he speaks to it as it shall be. Moses, stammering lips. Jeremiah, too young. Paul, thorn in the flesh. Peter, sinking in the waves. Yet to each one God says, my grace is sufficient. My strength is made perfect in weakness. That word perfect, in the Greek teleo, it means to complete, to fulfill, to finish the purpose. So your weakness is not a wall, it is a doorway. It is the place where he enters in. Not where the power ends, but where his power begins. You've prayed for the thorn to be removed, but what if the thorn is the very thing that's driving you to the throne? What if the breaking is the blessing in disguise? What if what you're trying to escape is the very place he wants to dwell? This is the mystery. He allows what he could prevent to perfect what he desires in you. Do you feel too weak to go on? Good. That means you're in the perfect place to go forward. Elijah, under the broom tree, praying to die, and yet an angel touches him, not to rebuke, but to revive. Arise and eat. The angel says, for the journey is too great for you. Yes, it is too great for you. But it's not too great for him in you. So arise, beloved. Your weakness does not disqualify you. It identifies you as the one he will use. He does not call the strong. He does not anoint the perfect. He chooses the flawed, the frail, the failing to display his glory through the cracks, like light through broken clay jars, like treasure in earthen vessels, like power through pierced hands. So bring him your weakness, your doubt, your fear, your addiction, your failure. Bring him what you've buried under shame. Lay it at the altar, and watch as the God who knows all things takes what was broken and makes it beautiful, takes what was weak and makes it a weapon, takes what was shattered and forges it into strength, for his strength is not beside your weakness, it is in it. And the day will come when you will say, I thank God for the thorn, for it brought me to the throne. I thank him for the weakness, because there I found his power. For God knows your weakness, and he has only one desire, to make you strong. God sees your weakness not to shame you, but to shape you. This is a truth that often gets lost in the noise of our struggles and the voices that tell us we are less than enough. When you feel broken, inadequate, or defeated, it can be easy to believe that your weaknesses are a mark of failure, something to hide, to be ashamed of, or to fix on your own. But the reality is far different. God's vision for your weakness is not condemnation, but transformation. He does not look at your frailty and turn away in disappointment. Rather, he looks with eyes full of purpose and love, ready to mold what is fragile into something strong and enduring. Think of the potter with his clay. The clay comes to the wheel cracked, misshapen, perhaps even crumbling, yet the potter does not reject it because of its flaws. He takes those imperfections and, with careful hands, begins to form a vessel that will hold water, sustain life, and fulfill a purpose far greater than the clay ever imagined. Your weakness is like that clay in the potter's hands. It is the raw material he uses to create a masterpiece. Your moments of failure, your fears, your wounds, these are not the end of your story, but the beginning of a new chapter where God's strength is revealed. God's knowledge of your weakness is intimate. He is not distant or unaware of your battles. He knows the places where you stumble, the secrets you try to bury, the wounds that still ache beneath your smile. And he says, I know, and I am with you. This knowing is not meant to shame you, but to comfort you. It is the divine acknowledgement that your struggles are real, and more importantly, that they do not disqualify you from his plan. In fact, they make you the perfect candidate for his transformative work. When you look at the stories of the great men and women of faith, you see this pattern repeated. They were not people without weakness or failure. They were people who were fully aware of their limitations and allowed God to work through them. Moses doubted his ability to lead. David wrestled with sin and despair. Paul was marked by a thorn in the flesh that plagued him constantly. Yet none of these weaknesses caused God to abandon them. Instead, their weaknesses became the stage on which God displayed his power. God's purpose is not to erase your weakness, but to use it as the foundation of your strength. The Bible tells us that his grace is sufficient and that his power is made perfect in weakness. This means that when you come to the end of your own strength, God's power steps in. Your vulnerability is not a barrier but a bridge to his strength. It is in those moments when you feel most weak that God's strength can shine most brightly. This reshaping process can be painful. The potter must sometimes break the vessel again to remake it stronger. You may experience seasons where you feel broken down, tested, and refined. These times are not punishments but part of the shaping process. They are the necessary steps that prepare you for the purpose God has for you. If you resist these seasons or try to hide your weaknesses, you risk missing the divine transformation waiting on the other side. God's love for you is relentless, especially when you are weak. He is not a distant judge waiting to point out your faults, but a compassionate Father who longs to heal and restore. His knowing of your weakness is an invitation to come to him honestly, without pretense or fear. It is a call to surrender your vulnerabilities and allow his strength to fill the places where you feel empty or broken. The truth is, no one is exempt from weakness. It is part of the human experience. But God's knowledge of your weakness is what makes you unique and valuable to him. It means he has chosen to walk with you through every struggle, every moment of doubt, every failure. He has a plan that includes your weakness, not in spite of it. He wants to take what seems like your greatest liability and turn it into your greatest testimony. You don't have to be strong in your own power. God is not asking you to mask your weakness or pretend you have it all together. He wants you to bring your weakness to him honestly, knowing that he will meet you there with strength. This is why the Apostle Paul could say, "When I am weak, then I am strong," because in his weakness, he experienced the fullness of God's power. Your weakness is not a flaw in God's plan. It is a crucial element. It is the place where he can work most deeply and effectively. So when you feel weak, remember that you are not alone. You are in the hands of the potter, being shaped for a purpose that only he can fulfill. Your weakness is the canvas on which God will paint a masterpiece of strength, resilience, and faith. Your weakness is the doorway to his strength. This is a divine paradox that challenges everything the world tells us about power and success. The world pushes us to hide our vulnerabilities, to cover our cracks, and to project an image of perfection. But God's kingdom operates on a different principle. It is not through our strength alone that we walk in victory, but through the very place where we feel weak, broken, and insufficient. It is in that place, the doorway of our weakness, that God's strength enters and transforms everything. When you find yourself at the end of your rope, when your resources are spent and your heart is weary, you stand at the threshold of God's power. That moment is not the end, but the beginning of something greater. It is the invitation to stop relying on your own abilities and start depending on his. The doorway is narrow and often uncomfortable, but it leads to a place where his strength becomes your strength. The Bible is full of stories that illustrate this truth. Consider the Apostle Paul, who carried a thorn in his flesh, a persistent weakness that caused him pain and limitation. He begged God 3 times to remove it, but God's answer was not to take it away. Instead, he said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul realized that his weakness was the very doorway through which God's power came. He learned to boast in his weaknesses so that Christ's power could rest upon him. This principle applies to you as well. Your weaknesses, whether they are fears, failures, broken relationships, or struggles you've carried for years, are not obstacles but openings. They are the very portals through which God's strength flows into your life. When you stop fighting your weakness and start inviting God in, you will find that His power covers your insufficiency and turns it into victory. Sometimes it takes a moment of surrender to walk through this doorway. You might resist because it feels exposing or humiliating to admit where you are weak, but God is not interested in your pride or your facade. He wants your honesty. He wants you to come as you are with all your brokenness so He can show you the fullness of His strength. The doorway of weakness often leads to greater humility, deeper faith, and a more intimate relationship with God. When you recognize that you cannot do it on your own, you are forced to rely on Him, and in that reliance you discover a strength you never knew was possible. It is a strength that is not dependent on circumstances, performance, or your own efforts, but on the unchanging power of God working through you. The story of Gideon reminds us of this truth. He was the least in his family, hiding in a winepress because of fear. Yet God called him mighty warrior. Gideon had to walk through the doorway of his weakness, his fear and insecurity, before God could raise him up to lead a victorious army. Your weakness is like Gideon's winepress, the place where God prepares you for the mission ahead. When you step through this doorway, you also become a witness to others. Your story of weakness transformed into strength can inspire and encourage those who face similar battles. You show them that they do not have to be perfect or strong on their own. They too can find strength by walking through the doorway of their own weaknesses and inviting God's power in. Remember, the doorway is not always easy to find. Sometimes it feels like a narrow crack in a wall, hard to see and even harder to walk through. But if you lean into your weakness with faith, God will open the door wider than you imagine. He will make a way where there seems to be no way. So when you feel weak, don't run from that feeling. Don't try to cover it up or escape it. Instead, see it as the doorway God has placed before you. Step through it with courage and trust, knowing that on the other side is His strength, waiting to fill you, empower you, and carry you forward. He calls you not by your flaw, but by your future. This is a powerful truth that challenges how we often see ourselves. When we are weighed down by our mistakes, failures, or weaknesses, it is easy to believe that these define us, that we are trapped by the worst moments of our past or the limitations we carry. But God does not call you according to your current condition or your flaws. He calls you by the promise of who you are destined to become. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern repeated again and again. God looks beyond the surface, beyond the mistakes and shortcomings, and sees the person you are meant to be. He calls Abram when he is old and childless, calling him the father of many nations. He calls David, the youngest and least likely son, from tending sheep to becoming a king. He calls Peter, a fisherman with impulsive flaws, to be the rock on which the church is built. God's calling is not based on your perfection. It is based on His vision. He does not wait for you to be flawless before He speaks to you or assigns you a purpose. Instead, He calls you out of your flaws and into the fullness of your future. This means that your past failures, your weaknesses, your doubts, they do not disqualify you. They do not cancel God's call on your life. When God calls you by your future, He is inviting you to step into a new identity. You are no longer defined by what you've done or what you've been through. You are defined by who God says you are. This is a call to transformation, a call to leave behind old labels and to walk into the new reality that God has prepared for you. This call often requires faith because the future God calls you to may seem impossible from where you stand. You might feel unworthy or incapable, but God's call is not based on your ability. It is based on His power. He calls you to trust Him, to step out even when the path is unclear, and to believe that He is working all things for your good. You see this in the life of Moses. When God called him from the burning bush, Moses doubted himself, saying he was slow of speech and not fit to lead. But God called him anyway, not as he was, but as he would become the deliverer of Israel. God's call transforms doubt into courage and weakness into leadership. To be called by your future means that God is not finished with you. He is still writing your story. The flaws you see today are just chapters, not the whole book. Your weakness, your mistakes, they are not the final word. The final word belongs to God, who calls you forward. This also means that when you hear God's call, you must release your grip on your past. You cannot move forward while clinging to the identities or failures that hold you back. God calls you to step into the new, to walk boldly toward the destiny He has prepared. When God calls you by your future, He also calls you into hope. It is a hope that transcends circumstance, a hope that says no matter where you've been, no matter how broken you feel, there is a glorious future waiting for you. This hope empowers you to persevere, to keep going when the road is hard, and to believe that God's plans for you are good. So listen carefully. God's voice does not come to condemn your past, but to proclaim your future. He calls you not because you are perfect, but because He is powerful. He calls you not to shame, but to purpose. He calls you out of weakness into strength, out of doubt into faith, and out of failure into victory. Your flaws do not define you. Your future with God does. Grace doesn't remove the thorn, it empowers you through it. This is a profound and sometimes difficult truth to accept. When life brings pain, hardship, or persistent struggles, what the Bible calls thorns, our natural desire is to ask God to take them away. We pray for relief, for healing, for an end to the difficulty. Yet often, God's answer is not to remove the thorn, but to give us the grace to endure and overcome through it. The Apostle Paul experienced this firsthand. He pleaded with God 3 times to remove the thorn in his flesh, a persistent trial that caused him great discomfort and weakness. But God's response was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This tells us that grace is not simply a pardon from pain. It is the divine strength that sustains us in the midst of it. Grace enables you to walk through hardship without being consumed by it. It doesn't necessarily mean the struggle will vanish, but it means God's presence and power will sustain you regardless of the thorn's persistence. Instead of being defeated by your weakness or trial, you learn to lean on a strength that is not your own. This empowering grace transforms the way you see your struggle. What once felt like a burden becomes a platform for God's power to be displayed. Your thorn, rather than being a symbol of defeat, becomes a testimony of endurance, faith, and the sustaining power of God. Living with the thorn means you discover a deeper dependence on God. It strips away self, sufficiency, and pride, forcing you to recognize your need for divine help every day. In that space, grace flows freely, renewing your spirit and strengthening your heart. Grace also teaches patience and perseverance. The journey through hardship is rarely quick or easy, but God's grace is there to carry you step by step, moment by moment. It is sufficient not just for one day or one crisis, but for every moment you face. Through grace, your weakness is not wasted. Instead, it becomes a vessel for God's glory. You become a living example of how God's power can shine brightest in our brokenness and struggle. This is why Paul could say he would boast gladly in his weaknesses, for through them the power of Christ rested upon him. Grace that empowers you through the thorn also brings peace. It calms the fear, the anxiety, and the despair that can come with persistent struggles. Knowing that God's grace is sufficient allows you to rest in His care, confident that He will never leave you or forsake you, even in the hardest seasons. So when you face your own thorns, whether they are physical, emotional, spiritual, or relational, remember that grace is not a promise to remove them immediately, but a promise to empower you through them. It is the divine strength that sustains you, the quiet power that carries you when you feel you cannot go on. Grace turns weakness into strength, despair into hope, and suffering into testimony. It is the lifeline that God offers so you can stand firm, not by your own power, but by the power of His sustaining love. Brokenness is the place where divine power enters. It is often in our most shattered moments, when we feel completely undone, that God's presence comes with the greatest force. The world tells us to avoid brokenness, to fix, to cover, to protect ourselves from vulnerability, but God's ways are higher. He uses brokenness not as a sign of failure, but as a gateway for His power to work through us. When you are broken, your defenses fall away. Your pride, your illusions of control, your self-reliance, all these walls crumble, and in that space of openness and humility, God's power can move freely. It is in brokenness that you become fully dependent on Him, and that dependence is the fertile ground where miracles begin. Consider the story of the woman with the alabaster jar. She broke open the jar of costly perfume, not carefully, but in a way that poured it out freely. Her brokenness was her offering, and through it, the power of God's love and forgiveness flowed. Sometimes God must break the vessel so the fragrance of His glory can be released. Brokenness also strips away the false identities we cling to. When life breaks us, it reveals what is real and what is not. It exposes the emptiness of relying on our own strength and the need for God's intervention. This revelation is painful, but it is necessary for transformation. Without brokenness, the heart remains hard, unable to receive the fullness of God's power. In Scripture, God often chose broken people for His greatest works. David, a man after God's own heart, was broken by his sins and failures. Yet God used that brokenness to craft a king who would rule with wisdom and humility. Paul, who suffered greatly, described his weaknesses as the very places where Christ's power was perfected. Their stories remind us that brokenness is not a barrier but a bridge to God's power. God's power in brokenness is not just about personal strength. It is about the ability to impact others. When you are broken and yet still standing, your life becomes a testimony. It encourages those who are hurting, showing them that they too can find strength in their weakness. Brokenness makes you relatable, approachable, and a vessel of God's grace. This divine power does not always come with dramatic signs or miracles. Sometimes it is a quiet strength, a peace that surpasses understanding, a patience that endures trials without giving up. It is the power that sustains you through long nights of doubt, the courage to keep going when the path is unclear, and the hope that refuses to be extinguished. When you embrace brokenness rather than resist it, you open the door for God's power to transform your life. You allow Him to take what seems like ruin and turn it into restoration, what feels like defeat and turn it into victory. Brokenness is not the end. It is the beginning of a new work, a new strength, a new testimony of God's glory made manifest. So don't fear brokenness or try to avoid it at all costs. Instead, welcome it as the place where God's power is waiting to enter, the place where your weakness becomes the stage for His strength to shine. What disqualifies you in man's eyes qualifies you in God's hands. The standards of the world are different from the standards of heaven. Where people see failure, God sees potential. Where others see rejection, God sees selection. Where the world dismisses and disqualifies, God chooses and equips. This is a profound truth that overturns every lie of inadequacy or unworthiness that tries to hold you back. In human terms, you may feel unqualified. Your past mistakes, your brokenness, your weaknesses may seem like reasons to be overlooked or passed by, but God's criteria are different. He looks beyond what is visible and judges the heart. He values faith, obedience, and a willing spirit above perfection. This means that what disqualifies you in the eyes of others can actually become the very thing that qualifies you for God's purpose. Look at the great leaders and prophets throughout the Bible. Many were rejected, flawed, or underestimated by society. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers, yet God elevated him to save nations. David was the youngest and least likely to be chosen as king, but God declared him a man after His own heart. Jonah ran from God's call, yet was still used to bring revival to a city. Their disqualifications in the eyes of men did not stop God's plan. They became the foundation for it. God uses what the world discards, your failures, your past, your weaknesses. They are not hindrances but building blocks. God's grace covers your imperfections and turns them into testimonies of his power and mercy. This is why no one is beyond God's reach, and no one is too broken to be used. When you understand this truth, it frees you from the fear of rejection and failure. You no longer need to meet the world's impossible standards or try to prove yourself by human measures. You can step into your calling with confidence, knowing that God sees your heart and your potential, not just your flaws. This also calls you to humility. Recognizing that you are qualified by God's grace, not your own merit, keeps you dependent on him. It reminds you that your strength comes from his power, not your own efforts. This dependence opens the door for God to work mightily through you. So when you feel disqualified by the world, remember, God's qualifications are different. What disqualifies you in man's eyes qualifies you in God's hands. You are chosen, equipped, and empowered for the purpose he has set before you, not because of who you are now, but because of who he is working to make you.